Hello. Welcome to Civilization Jihad Awareness, the show where truth wins every time. Let's just start talking about where that term comes from because it's not a term I created. It's a term created by the Muslim Brotherhood of North America to describe their war against North America. Yes, that term jihad does mean war. So where do I get that from? It comes from a document discovered by a wonderful, through the actions of one police officer. I say one police officer because, we don't think about how important law enforcement is. This police officer in 2004, a Maryland transit officer, observed a woman in a burqa taking pictures of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge support structure. The officer watched. She got in a car with the man who was driving, and recorded the suspicious behavior. Took the ID from the guy, and flag came up when he ran it through the system. Ismail FBI for questioning. They searched his house, thanks to him, one police officer catching him. They discovered 90 bankers' boxes in a hidden dugout sub-basement. And in one document in this, of these 90 banker boxes worth of documents, it's called the Explanatory Memorandum. It was used in the federal court system. Let me just read one paragraph from that. It says, the process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. Without this level of understanding, we are not up to this challenge and have not prepared ourselves for jihad yet. It is a Muslim's perform jihad and work wherever he is and wherever he lands until the final hour comes. And there is no escape from that destiny except for those who choose to slack. But would the slackers and the mujahideen be equal? Again, it's not a term I created, but it is something that I'm very concerned about, and I've named the show after. We have to be careful. We have to be watchful. And today I have invited one of the great persons that works for the Investigative Project on Terrorism, does an incredible work and has done incredible work for a number of years. I've invited Patrick Dunleavy, a fellow New Yorker. He spent 26 years as part of an elite team of investigators. Began his career with the Department of Correctional Services as a corrections officer. In 1988, he was assigned to the Office of the Inspector General. During his career, he worked undercover infiltrating criminal enterprises and contract murder conspiracies. He also worked as a hostage negotiator in design and implementation of a data system used to gather intelligence on criminal activity involving drug trafficking. 2001, 9/11/2001, Patrick Dunleavy was appointed Deputy Inspector General of the Criminal Intelligence Unit. And at the request of various agencies, Mr. Dunleavy has been the speaker on the topic of terrorist recruitment to organizations such as the FBI, Canadian CSIS, Canadian Intelligence Services. In June of 2011, Patrick Dunleavy testified before the House Committee on Homeland Security. And the reason I've asked him here is because he wrote one incredible article about terrorists getting early release. And if you go up to the top of the room, you'll see in the description, I thought I put a link in there. If I didn't, you can go to investigativeproject.org and look for the article, John Walker Lind Should Not Be Released Early. And that is the discussion that we're going to be having today. And I believe he's on the line. So welcome, Mr. Dunleavy.
Thanks for having me, Paul. How are you?
I'm so happy to have you back. I read this article and I was kind of mind blown that somebody else is thinking the same way I am, but I had a hard time when I read another article about his release and you clarified it for me. I didn't figure out I couldn't figure out where they were saying he had served 20 years and he was getting out. Nobody said anything about early release. You're the only one who said it. I want to say thank you for that. Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about how?
The problem with
I'm sorry.
Sure, Paul. I think the problem is that the general public doesn't understand that when an individual gets sentenced to prison, just the way normal sentencing laws are, both in the state level and the federal level, the inmates are given what's known as good time or time off for good behavior. In the case of John Walker Lynn, he received 54 days of good time for every year he's in prison. So when he was sentenced to 20 years, it was already calculated that he would receive approximately 2.5 years off his sentence, and that's given to the inmate up front.
Wow.
He has to basically riot, escape, or do some other hideous act while he's in prison to get it taken away. So that's how he was given over 2.5 years of time off for good behavior, which just the term itself seems incredulous. This is an individual who took up arms against the United States, and we're giving him good behavior time awards.
So can you remind people who John Walker Lynn is and why he's in prison before we go too much farther? Because that in itself is just kind of mind-blowing for those people who don't know.
Sure. John Walker Lynn, in November of 2001, which was about a month and a half after the 9/11 attack by Al-Qaeda in New York City and in the Pentagon, we had sent some forward officers to Afghanistan because we knew that's where Osama bin Laden and the other leaders of Al-Qaeda were operating from. And at the time, a group of jihadists were captured by U.S. allied forces and were being held in a prison in Afghanistan. And we had two CIA officers. One of them was an individual by the name of John Michael Spann. He was known as Johnny Spann. John was a former decorated United States Marine officer who then joined a CIA paramilitary unit. And he was in Afghanistan in a forward unit, and he and his partner were interviewing the individuals that had been captured when all of a sudden somebody said, "We have an American." And so they brought up this ragtag kid, and at first they asked him, "Are you Irish?" And then he said American, and they found out who he was, and so they began to talk to him in regard to what was going on, how he had become involved with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, what were some of the operational things that Al-Qaeda had planned. They were trying to get information. What happened is at the time that they were interviewing John Walker Lynn, the rest of the inmates in the prison were already plotting to overtake the prison and escape. They had secured weapons and explosives, and John Walker Lynn never said anything to the CJA officers who were interviewing him. Subsequently, when John went back in population, the riot broke out, and in the ensuing fight, Johnny Spann was shot and killed by the terrorists. He was later, John Walker Lynn was then taken into custody, put on a U.S. Navy ship, and brought back to the United States, and was going to be tried. I believe the original indictment was over 10 counts, including charges of conspiracy to commit murder against a U.S. officer. And then at some point, there was a plea bargain made between the Department of Justice and Spann's legal team, not Spann, but John Walker Lynn, and he was allowed to plead guilty to a simple providing material support to the Taliban, as well as having an explosive device, and he got a straight 20-year sentence.
It's mind-numbing.
Yeah.
That is just mind-numbing.
The Spann family,
you went through
every time this guy's name, every time Lynn's name comes up, the Spann family, it's an open wound, and one family member actually described it as a slap in the face. And now he's walking out while Johnny Spann is dead.
Yeah, Every time I hear this man's name, I get disgusted, and I hear about terrorists being charged with terrorism or support rather than charges of treason or charges of sedition, which we don't charge people with unless we're at war, unfortunately. I don't understand why we haven't charged him with treason, because what he did was support an enemy. That's the charge. That's the legal charge that should have been given to him. But,
well, that exactly. I think that particular argument. Andrew McCarthy was a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District in New York, who originally prosecuted the First World Trade Center bombers. Had written an article regarding how are we going to deal with the terrorists that we capture. Are we going to treat them as enemy combatants, or are we going to treat them as common criminals? And very articulate article in terms of, well, if you're going to treat them on enemy combatants, this is the way they have to be processed. Once you say they're going to treat them as criminals and you put them into the justice system, you now afford them rights. And this is what has happened with John Walker Lynn, because John Walker Lynn never renounced his form of radical Islam. In fact, when he went into the Bureau of Prisons, he sued the Bureau of Prisons for not allowing him to practice his form of Islam as he wanted to. He said that he wanted to pray 5 times a day. Well, the Bureau of Prisons said, you can pray as many times as you want. You just pray in your cell. He said, no, my particular form of Islam says we have to have corporate prayer. I have to meet with all the other Muslim brothers in prison at least 5 times a day. Well, he went to court and won the case. And the judge awarded him the decision because the judge, and the reason the judge gave it, we get back to this good behavior dilemma that I was talking about. The judge said that even though John Walker Lynn was a convicted terrorist who had taken up arms and possessed an explosive device, while he was in prison, he was a model inmate. And so why should he not be allowed out of his cell? And again, we get to that good behavior of what is a model inmate. Inmates have known for years, common criminals know for years, when you go into prison, you play the game, you become jail-wise. You pretend to be rehabilitated, reformed, and that helps you to get out of prison earlier. So John Walker Lynn just played that. He wasn't attacking any correctional officers. He wasn't trying to escape. He didn't have a handcuff key or hacksaw blade. And so the judge in that particular case, as well as the good time that he's receiving, said, well, this is a model inmate, and disregarded the fact that he had taken up arms against the United States and was responsible, at least in part, for the death of a U.S. officer, Johnny Spann.
Now, would he still be under a conditional release, like a parole after those 3 years, until the 20 years is up? They've changed the name over the course of history, which is kind of humorous in one sense. Originally, we would call it something like parole. In states, certain states, we would still say they have parole systems. In others, they would call it supervised release. So he's, in one sense, he's under supervised release. But as to what those particular conditions are they the same as a burglar who gets out? This is one of the issues that's come up with releasing convicted terrorists. What conditions of release, what type of supervisory conditions should they have? Now, for instance, I can tell you, if someone who had gone to prison as a burglar or something like that had an alcohol problem, they may have certain conditions that restrict them from going to bars. Whereas when you talk about someone who's a convicted Islamic terrorist, would some of those conditions include certain mosques that they weren't allowed to attend, or is that an infringement on their religious rights? These are all things that should have been thought out years and years ago when we first started to put convicted terrorists into the prison system. What happens when they get out? And we kind of pushed that ball down the field until now we're faced with, I think, over 60 individuals about to be released over the next 5 years. And as yet, we have not come up with a specific program. The Internet. Now, should a convicted terrorist be released? Should his
internet activity, his social media activity, should that be monitored or even controlled? We know that John Walker Lynn was drawn to Islam through the internet. We know that the groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others, Al-Shabaab, have used the internet to recruit and to post videos and speeches and everything, trying to draw in other individuals. So when a convicted terrorist gets out, should their social media activity definitely should probably, in my opinion, should be monitored, if not curtailed. But we haven't set up these specific conditions.
And that gets us into a whole other thing. I'm just sitting here kind of amazed. I mean, we talk about things like recidivism when we talk about criminals, and
right.
You're bringing up other things. I want to go back and mention. You did mention one other person. You mentioned Kevin James when you wrote the article.
Yeah, and I was thinking about him when you used the term sedition. Kevin James was not a former inmate, but he was an inmate in the California Department of Corrections. He was a member of the 76th Street Crips gang. When he came into prison, he basically was a follower of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan. He was a nominal Muslim, wasn't what we consider a fundamentalist. But at some point, he decided to form his own Islamic group. It was called the JIS, or the Assembly of Authentic Islam in Arabic. And from that, he recruited other inmates, and he began to plot attacks against the United States military recruiting stations, as well as Jewish facilities in the greater Los Angeles area. He did this while he was in New Folsom Prison. While he was an inmate in a California prison, he actually orchestrated and formulated attacks. He used other inmates, like one of them was LeVar Washington, who had been paroled, was using LeVar to carry out these robberies to gain money so that they could do the attacks. He was tried and found guilty of sedition against the United States. The judge in the case had said that this was a sophisticated operational terrorist organization. It was not just a philosophy. It was not just a radicalization. They were actually operational. And others have said that we have not seen this type of operational terrorism since the 9/11 attack. He gets out in January. He'll walk out of prison. And it seems, again, incredible that we would take an individual who was in prison, formed his own radical Islamic group, conspired to commit attacks against the United States, and now we're saying, well, time's up. You get to go home. What's going to happen when he gets out? What are going to be the conditions for his release?
And no one is asking any questions about ideology. They're only thinking about time served.
Yeah,
that in itself is scary.
It's something we push down. We've like I said, we've kind of kicked this ball down the field for over 17, 18 years. It goes on beyond that. I actually wrote an article back in 10 years ago regard to the roots of radical Islam in prison, and I mentioned individuals who had been arrested in the late 70s, early 80s, who had ties to Islamic terror organizations over in the Middle East. Many of them were Palestinian with Jordanian citizenships who were getting out of prison at that time. And nobody was looking at, well, what do we do once they get out? Normal recidivism rate. So just take a normal, and this is just a societal problem we have. An individual gets arrested for burglaries, robberies, drugs, assault, whatever crime you want to name, and they go into prison. And there's supposed to be programs there that are going to deal with why the individual committed the crime that they did. Was it an educational thing? Was it a social thing? Was it a family thing? Was it a substance abuse problem? All these things are supposed to be addressed while they're in prison, so that when they come out, they have a greater chance of assimilating back into society as a normal member. But what we have just as a rule is between 40 and 60% of individuals released from prison within the first 3 to 5 years of their release reoffend. That means they go back, they get arrested, they get set back into prison. Now, we have that because we have a failure in trying to rehabilitate normal criminals. When we get convicted Islamic terrorists who are driven by an ideology that goes beyond this world, they believe that they're working for paradise, what's going to be the recidivism rate there? I was just looking at an article, actually it was put out by the Department of Homeland Security back in 2012 regarding recidivism rates of Guantanamo Bay detainees who had been released. And back as far as 2016, they had a 21% recidivism rate among terrorists from Guantanamo that we sent back over to different countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and stuff like that. Now,
well, since you're mentioning the ones we released, where are those 5 kings today?
Yeah, and think of how that affects the morale of the U.S. servicemen and women who have given their lives to protect us. You know, I fight you once, now I've got to fight you again. That's what we're looking at. Now, when we're releasing individuals from U.S. prisons, are they going to fall into the same recidivism rate? Is it the same turnaround? Well, we say, well, no way they're going to go back 40 to 60% of terrorists recommitting. But what if it's only 10%? What if only 10% of those 60 recommit terrorist acts? Is that something that we really want to accept? I don't think so. I don't think the American public at large would want to accept something like that. The fact that an individual like... go ahead.
Even in your books, Fertile Soil for Jihad, I think you hint at this as a future problem, and I remember going through that book, and you were talking back then about we need to think about this future, and you were talking about particular individuals and the ideology. You were extensive on what their ideology was and how it was dangerous. I'm kind of mind blown when I think about nobody really asking that question except for people like yourself. And why does it take the people ask? Why aren't they listening to us asking these questions? Is another thing maybe we need to ask. You came up with. I should go back. I'm trying to fit my questions here. Okay. You proposed you're talking about a possible solution, or it's not really a solution. There's something you were talking about called the Tracer Act.
I talk about a national registry for convicted terrorists.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, that, and again, that's not just another watch list. We have a number of watch lists that people are on, whether it's a no-fly. The National Registry for Convicted Terrorists will be individuals who are convicted of crimes, not just suspected of crimes. It would work in the same manner as the sex offender registry works. Now, we've done that. Well, we saw a predominant problem with released sex offenders, whether they were pedophiles or serial rapists. We knew that we had to control them because they were prone to re-engage, to commit crimes. And so we monitor where they live, what type of social activity they have, what places they're allowed to go, and all that information is transferred to the local authorities. For instance, if a sex offender gets paroled to Rochester, New York, well, the Rochester PD are going to be notified of him, and then he's going to have to register and give account of where he's living and where he's working, stuff like that. Why would we not do the same with a convicted terrorist? So that local authorities, we have these watch lists that nobody in the local authorities see. And by and large, it's local law enforcement officers who are faced with dealing with these individuals. So that would be one of the things that we would consider doing, this registry And again, only for individuals that were convicted of crimes, not suspected. The information would be forwarded to local, city, state authorities so that they would be able to know who's in their neighborhood. That's a basic thing. One of the acts, Representative Rutherford from Florida, backed by Representative McCall from Texas, had put forth an act called the Tracer Act. And the Tracer Act would establish a national registry as well as other conditions of release for convicted terrorists. That's a step in the right direction. Hopefully, that bill has passed the House of Representatives. It's sitting in the Senate as part of a Department of Homeland Security general bill, and hopefully, if that gets enacted, we will at least taking a step towards doing something about released terrorists.
But we need to have this passed before May, correct?
Well, it's already like I said, it's already in the House.
Or in the Senate, you said,
it's
right?
already passed the House, and it's now in the Senate as part of a bill. And hopefully that would be done because it's just going to keep going. Everybody thinks, well, and again, when someone gets sentenced to prison, they think, well, that's it. We'll never see them again. There's already been individuals who have been released who were convicted of terrorism. We think that everyone's doing a life sentence, and as we've seen from John Walker Lynn, that's not true. Many times individual sentences can always be changed, even though we think someone's in life sentence will never get out. Things happen over a period of time. People get resentenced. People file appeals. Laws get changed. Good time for your behavior is given, and you get out. And we should be prepared. There's no excuse for us not having been prepared.
That is unfortunately the actual correct answer. There's no excuse. It's kind of mind-numbing when I think about this. Here we have a country. We have one of the best criminal justice systems, I think, in the world. For both the defendant and for the accused and for the innocent, I should say. They could be both the same person. We don't, and yet, right now, if you're convicted of terrorism, I believe the average charge for terrorism, depending on, I think it was average charge was 20 years, if I remember correct, between 20 and 40 years. It's not as severe.
True, but what happens a lot of times is, again, in these plea deals, like John Walker Lynn is a classic example, an individual who should have either gotten the death penalty or a life sentence, got a plea arrangement. Many, many cases of individuals conspiring to commit terrorist acts have been pled down. I'll give you a recent example. Casey Spain, who was released from South Carolina Department of Corrections, was a sex offender, converted to Islam, wanted to join ISIS, got out of prison, and was trying to get a weapon so that he could commit a terrorist act. Well, eventually he was arrested, and what we allowed him to do was plead to unlawful possession of a weapon. Many times, just to make the case go faster, the individual who was arrested for a terrorist act pleads down to a lesser charge, even though it was a terrorist-related one. And that's happened numerous times.
This is scary stuff.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes, it is.
Wow. And listen, my train of thought, I'm just kind of amazed when I start thinking about, we have so many people that I can think about, we're locking up for 20 to 30 years, and I'm kind of mind blown that it's because we're putting it into the criminal justice system. We're not treating it as maybe we need to take treason out, make terrorism out of the criminal justice system, and make it. There
are certain things that we can do in regard to changing that. Even I understand plea agreements happen because just the overwhelm, burden on district attorneys and judges and courts and everything like that. So I have no problem with letting an individual plead to a possession of a weapon, as long as you stipulate in the documents that it was a terrorist-related crime, and then it goes towards being on that registry.
Yes.
That's the thing that we're really looking for. The overwhelming factors in why there's a difference between a guy getting a gun because he wants to go rob a 7-Eleven or something like that, as opposed to an individual who wants to get an M16 so that he can commit acts of jihad, or wants to make pipe bombs or something like that. So as long as that was put in the sentencing stipulations, I would not have a problem with allowing certain plea arrangements just to get the cases processed and get the individual off the street.
What do you have any other suggestions for our congressman on what we could do? The registry sounds like a great idea, and it sounds like they're working on it. So my suggestion for everybody is call your congressman and encourage them to get it done before April is over.
I would say the person who's really in control of that right now, and is probably a good guy in our corner, Mitch McConnell, who's the lead Republican in the Senate, can bring that. It's already, like I said, the Tracer Act not only provides for the National Registry, but it also provides for the information being shared with other law enforcement agencies. That bill is already sitting in the Senate. It simply has to be brought to the floor and voted on and passed, because it's already passed in the House. So, contact Mr. McConnell and say we need it. We need it.
You're law enforcement. And I keep hearing from people who are FBI or former FBI that it's the local officers that make the difference. So this is the all-important thing. It's I guess just like in the beginning of my show every time, I usually talk about the one officer who just doing his job, just observing somebody doing something, allowed us to obtain those 90 bankers boxes of Muslim Brotherhood documents. Just one officer, just doing his job.
Yeah, that's how the Al Qaeda manual was found by a cop in Manchester, in the UK. If your listeners want to read a book, it's called Jihad in Brooklyn. It's about a case that happened years and years ago. Individuals who were constructing bombs in an apartment in Brooklyn were going to blow up, commit terrorist acts, and one of the individuals who knew about it ran to a subway cop down near, I believe, the Long Island station of Flatbush Avenue, and started telling him all this stuff. And that subsequently led to emergency services and coming to the scene and defusing what would have been a bomb factory. But again, it's the first line officer who first all of a sudden is hit with this information. The more information you can put into the first line officer's hand, credible, good information on who he has, whether it's a traffic stop, whether it's just a simple interview, it's vital. It's important. And we need that information in their hands.
Definitely. I want to say thank you. You're always a wealth of information. You kind of surprise me every time with more than I ever expect. Could you tell people about what you do for Investigative Project on Terrorism, about the organization, and
sure.
do promote your book and your work too?
Well, the Investigative Project on Terrorism is Steve Emerson, who's one of the foremost experts on terrorism, is the executive director of that. Steve's been around, and that organization has looked at terrorist acts and organizations. You can go to the website, investigativeproject.org. If you wanted to look up, for instance, if you wanted to look up John Walker Lynn, if you wanted to see his actual sentencing or indictment, you could pull up those documents on the Investigative Project. That would be the place that I would say you could find the most information if you're looking for historical as well as current information on terrorism, not just in the United States but globally, and it is a global problem. The Investigative Project on Terrorism, nonprofit organization, does not take any federal monies for support. Again, Steve Emerson is the executive director of that, and appreciate your support.
Please, if you have extra cash, please throw it their way. They are in my mind, they are the top organization in the states that that gets the truth out. And just like we have Patrick Dunleavy here, they do testify before Congress. Steve Emerson has been there. Mr. Dunleavy has been there. These are the guys that, in many ways, are a front line for us. They might be speaking to Congress,